Fellas, is the UFC really falling off? And I bring this up because we've just had UFC Atlanta, which might be top 3 worst UFC events this year. Since Malco Melmaker knocked out Chris Mutino, this entire card got cursed. It was just decision after decision, boring fight after boring fight. It was a really hard watch. We even had that Paul Craig Bellator situation, which was a weird DQ, but it ended up being as a no contest. I'm sat there at 6 a.m, birds are chirping, people are walking their dog, and I'm watching this card, and it's just hard to get through. I was barely, like, if you listen to the breakdown I did after, I was barely getting through it. Fellas, the Nigerian Nightmare is back. Like, he pretty much never let... Oh, fuck. Does he pretty easily controls wacky... Oh, what a dodgy intro. Like, this card, in a nutshell, was Usman dominating Buckley, Wellmaker getting a highlight reel, Jose Ochoa knocking out Corey Durden, and that's pretty much it. And there was like 15 fights on this card. And just 3 weeks ago as well, we had Blanchfield versus Barber, which in my opinion was the worst card in UFC history. Not even debatable, it was awful. And early this year, from like February to March, we're on a generationally bad run. 9 weeks in a row and not a single great card. From like February to March, if you look at this 9 card stint, if you just individually look at every card, not a single one of them was a great or standout card. And I feel like UFC cards are losing personality. Like, it just seems like day in, day out, week in, week out, these UFC cards, they just feel all the same. Like, even just go back to 2022, like a UFC London card, you'd have exciting English prospects, you'd have a UK event atmosphere, you had personality, the crowd were booming because it was the first UK event they'd had in years. Every fight, most UK fighters performed, and not even just the fact that UK fighters performed, but every card just felt like it had meaning to it. It felt like each individual card had personality. Even the pay-per-views, you'd have big title fights and exciting contenders, stacked cards. Every individual fight had value to it, every fight had significance to it. And I just feel like UFC cards back then feel different to how they do now, because even just the good cards nowadays, considered good cards, every card is forgettable. Like, we'll have a good card or a decent card, a week later we've forgotten about it, we'll never talk about it again. And I'm sat watching some UFC fights these days, and I'm just daydreaming while I'm watching it, because I'm just trying to get through it and watch the next fight. And I have no emotion to most of these fights that go on. I'm just aimlessly watching them with no stimulus watching some of these fights, and maybe it's a me problem, and you can say I'm just cherry picking. But even if we do comparison, UFC London 2022 compared to 2025, 8 finishes compared to 4. The hometown heroes of 2022, look how many hometown heroes were there back in 2022 compared to the 2025 London card. The other big names back in 2022 compared to nowadays. And if it was like UFC 314 and 317 are like the only mega cards this year, I'm not saying they're the only good cards, but they're the only real mega cards we've had this year. And we're halfway through this year. What actually has happened this year in the UFC? What significant thing has happened this year so far in the UFC? And I feel like we should go back to 3 cards a month. 2 crowded fight nights, 1 pay-per-view, no Apex card, because Apex is just an unskippable ad for ESPN. And on the topic of Apex cards, they've recently announced or leaked a bunch of fights for UFC Vegas 108. This is a really good card, and there's so many fights in here that should be in front of a crowd that they've just sticked in the Apex. And again, it's a great card, and of course I'm going to watch it, but you know, like Rumbetsky versus Chris Duncan, that's going to be a fight of the year contender. Why have they stuck it in the Apex? And you look at the summer schedule for the UFC, don't get me wrong, it's heat. We have so many good fights this summer, but it is only like a handful of fights that I'm really looking forward to out of the upcoming fights we've got coming up in summer. And I promise I'll shut up about this topic too. I'll try and go over it quickly. But Jones and Aspinall, is it happening? Is it not? Tom Aspinall's been saying that he's got some exciting fight news coming soon. I don't buy it. We've been waiting since November for some exciting fight news. Francis Ngannou, they're promoting this guy as that he hits harder than a Ford Escort. Tom Aspinall, he's doing YouTube shorts on his favourite British food.
What's your sandwich? My kids love a bit of fish fingers, but as a fully grown man, 32 years old, I'll put that at 8, I think. Curly fries, elite, we're gonna go for 3.
And yesterday, Dana White went on a short and said, if we can't get this fight done, we'll move on quickly. We'll have answers in the next couple of weeks. Well, he says, if we can't get this fight done, you were telling us a couple of weeks back that this fight is 100% going to happen. No way this fight doesn't happen. It's 100% happening. And now you're saying it's going to happen. And he's also said, we'll have answers in the next couple of weeks. Jones's last fight was in November. Why have we not negotiated by now? The UFC should have negotiated this by April or at least May. This should have been done by now. And we should have an announcement by June for the heavyweight undisputed title. Old Dana White would not have let this shit happen. He would have stripped John Jones, taken away the belt from him if he's not willing to fight, and he would have just pulled out some wacky shit like Tom Aspinall versus Brock Lesnar or some shit. Old Dana White stood on business. Dana White reveals the one goal he still hasn't achieved in the UFC, and he said, I will have achieved my goal when the UFC has had a live event in every country in the world. Focus on the basics. All we want is stacked cards and the best versus the best on a consistent basis, which isn't that big of an ask. And he's out here bringing out UFC BJJ and UFC North Korea. And he keep on the topic of him bringing a UFC live event in every country. Well, you know, not really doing a good job at that. You had 3 African champions. You failed to have a single card in Africa. Your DDP, where's your South Africa card? Where's Taporia's Spanish card? Where's a card in Japan that I'm pretty sure hasn't happened since 2017? And on the topic of supply and demand, look at the fight promo we want. It's pretty evident that MMA fans, we want to go back to face-to-face promotions, whether it's online or just some sort of face-to-face promotion for a fight. I think would really help sell a fight and bring the rivalry up. And instead, we're getting this brain rot content on YouTube Shorts, which is like TikTok shit, and Nina drama plastered all over the recommended page. And listen, I understand it's not all the UFC's fault. Like, if we go back on the topic of UFC Atlanta, so many fights on this card I thought was going to be a banger, and then ended up being only like 2 good bangers on the card. And obviously that's not the UFC's fault. There were a lot of fights on that card I thought there's no way this goes distance, and without surprise ended up going the distance. And this brings me back onto the topic of fight to pay. People always saying we need to pay fighters more, comparing it to like the NBA and NFL and other big promotions. Look at Michael Chiesa versus Court McGee. Those guys shouldn't be getting anywhere close to 100k. Michael Chiesa got 300k for that fight against Court McGee. That was a glorified sparring session. Bruce Buffer probably takes more damage announcing fights than Michael Chiesa does in that fight. There was a glorified sparring session. He got 300k for that. I think we should increase bonuses instead, whether it be quantity of bonuses, whether it be the bonus amount, because I feel like increasing fighter pay does nothing. It's not going to increase the urgency. It does nothing. Whereas I feel like increasing bonuses is likely going to lead to more highlights, more finishes, and it could take a card like UFC Atlanta into something much better. And I feel like the only enjoyable cards this year, like the only really enjoyable cards, there've only been like a handful of them. A couple of pay-per-views, a couple of fight nights. There's been a lot of these cards that have gone by, and the next week they're forgettable. And the matchmakers as well, focusing on Power Slap, Canelo Crawford, UFC BJJ, and UFC altogether. They shouldn't be doing that. Why are you putting 25% on the UFC? I don't understand why the UFC, or specifically Dana White, has got a bunch of different like avenues that he's trying to go down. It should be 100% UFC. Boxing's having its best year. Boxing has been thriving this year. So many massive events, so many big events that are coming up as well. Boxing's doing great. UFC's having its worst year. UFC has not done anything so far this year, and so many people are claiming that it's fallen off. And Dana White, rather than putting all these eggs into one basket, is now focusing on boxing, these other avenues to go down. And you notice how after every UFC event, Dana's always talking about some sort of gate record or tickets or business. He's never talking about fighters. He's never talking about champions. He's never talking about anything that's actually relevant to the fans. And he's recently just announced this UFC Abu Dhabi card. Don't get me wrong, absolute banger of a fight now. I'll give him credit for that. But Evloev versus Pico. Nobody asked for this fight. If you're going to get Evloev on the card, if you're going to get Pico on the card, fair enough, but this fight makes no sense as well. Evloev should be getting a title fight. Peter Yan versus Marcus McGee. Peter Yan's on a 2-fight winning streak, arguably deserves a title shot. He's now fighting down against number 13 ranked Marcus McGee. And the sad thing about this whole thing with Evloev and Pico is it's likely going to lead to Volkanovski versus Yair Rodriguez too, which is just keeping up the theme of undeserved, unwanted title fights, which seems to be the new era we're in the UFC. UFC 317 is an absolute mega card. The UFC should be promoting this like crazy. They should be doing world tours in Spain, world tours in Brazil, a sit-down face-to-face, longer press conferences, potentially one in each country. This should be one of the most promoted fights of this year because it's one of the biggest fights of this year. It definitely will be a huge mega fight. And instead, we're probably going to get some crappy countdown show, a 15-minute press conference hosted by John Anik that gets cut short, where the questions like, how was fight camp? And the promotion is going to be very basic, I reckon. And you get poor performances plus poor promotion, and it leads to less interest and potentially the argument that the UFC is falling off. Now, there is also an argument why the UFC isn't falling off. I'm not just trying to become the channel that hates on the UFC every week. Statistically, the UFC is probably bigger now than it's ever been before. I assume that the UFC fan base is bigger now than it's been before. There's a huge UFC fan base. It's thriving social media wise, and I'm sure just number wise, the UFC is doing amazing right now. The fan base for the UFC is growing, and it's probably bigger than ever. And this whole argument that there's a lack of stars, I also disagree with. There's so many stars in the UFC, up and coming and rising stars, stars that are in their prime, stars that might be towards the end of their career but still sell tickets. There's a lot of name value in the UFC right now. Just because McGregor and Khabib aren't around doesn't mean there's a lack of stars for all the casual fans that always like to complain about this. And there are exciting times ahead. DDP versus Chimaev in August. That might be one of the best fights in modern UFC history. This is going to go down as one of the most exciting fights. 50-50, two guys in their prime at their best. Mega fight. Like I said, Topuria Oliveira, UFC 317, probably going to be the best card of 2025. That's a banger that I'm looking forward to as well. Holloway versus Poirier, guaranteed banger. One of those fights that you just know is going to be a sick fight. And there's a lot of other cards coming up as well, and other fights coming up that I'm looking forward to. So I'm not just trying to hit on the UFC, and more external talent now than ever, apart from the Strikeforce merge. Bringing over Kayla Harrison, Patricio Pitbull, Patchy Mix, Kaya Sakura, Pico, Horiguchi, Reina Derrida. The UFC seem to be bringing in external talent more than ever, and this is something that we asked for in the past last couple of years. We want more big names outside the UFC coming over to the UFC. And I've got to give it to them. They've done a good job. Every couple of months we'll have a big name outside the UFC coming over to the UFC. Some will succeed, some will fail. But the point is, the UFC are bringing over talent, which is what we need. So those are some reasons why the UFC isn't falling off. And it is just a bit of a debate that keeps going on. Anyway, some new fight announcements that the UFC have announced over the last couple of weeks, or at least have been leaked over the last couple of weeks. First one, MVP versus Jared Cannonier. I don't really know how I feel about this matchup. I feel like it's really random. Like, nobody saw this coming, but it's also quite an intriguing fight. You've got the speed and defense from MVP, who's considered one of the best strikers in the UFC, against Jared Cannonier, who's kind of just brute force and power, as he just absolutely destroyed Gregory Rodriguez. It's going to be an interesting fight. I did think that MVP was going to move down to welterweight, though. That was kind of the talk. The Sharp Putimagomedov fight was supposed to be a one-time thing at middleweight, but he's sticking in that division against Jared Cannonier. And listen, if MVP can get past him, he's going to be in title contention. I reckon they're going to go down the avenue of MVP versus Adesanya, so that's an interesting fight. Really don't know who to pick at this moment in time, but should be a good one. We've also got Peyton Talbot, one of the biggest prospects of 2024, against Felipe Lima. The UFC, I don't really know what the matchmakers are thinking. It seems like Dana White and the UFC, since Peyton Talbot lost, they've just forgotten about him. They've even stuck him on the early prelims of UFC 317 against Felipe Lima. Felipe Lima is an absolute beast, by the way. If you don't know who he is, he's a former Octagon champion. He's on a huge winning streak. He's looked really good in the UFC so far. This is a terrible fight for Peyton Talbot, another heavy grappler who has top 15 worthy. This is actually a step up from Hany Barcelos, who we just lost to, so it doesn't really seem like the UFC care about keeping Peyton Talbot as this big prospect. They're not feeding him as a can, but to be fair, I respect it. He's still in there with a tough guy, and if he can get through Felipe Lima, I feel like Peyton Talbot's got all of his hype back again. We've also got Said Nurmagomedov versus Bryce Mitchell. Another weight class change. Bryce Mitchell's moving down to the bantamweight division, which I didn't really think weight was an issue for Bryce Mitchell, but he's now moving against Said Nurmagomedov. Should be interesting. Two good submission artists, two guys with decent striking. Should be a good scrap. Nico Price versus Jacoby Smith. This is a hydrogen bomb versus a coffin baby. If you don't know Jacoby Smith, this guy's an absolute brute. I think he's going to be top 5 welterweight within 2 years. He's got an average fight time of about 1 minute. He's been destroying people left, right, and center. Undefeated. KO power on the feet with a wrestling background. He's a beast. Nico Price at this point will probably lose to Nick Diaz. This is going to be a one-sided beatdown where Jacoby Smith is going to absolutely destroy and probably retire Nico Price. So if you're into violence and you're into an absolute beating, watch this fight. Talking of UFC 317, Justin Tafa's pulled out on some random bold block from the regional scene. He's now going to be taking on Denise. He's got a winning streak. He's undefeated. Not really much more I can say, but that's going to be on 317. Michel Pereira versus Marco Tulio. If you don't know who Marco Tulio is, he's like a shooter box fighter with the likes of Oliveira and Ian Gary. He might actually be the best striker right now from shooter box. He's one of the best strikers coming up in the middleweight division. Absolutely destroyed Trezeguet Gore. Michel Pereira's been falling off recently. He obviously once was still a bit of a prospect. Still a dangerous dude, but he's looked really flat in his last 2 fights. This should be interesting. I'm picking Marco Tulio. He's an absolute beast, and if he can get past Michel Pereira, top 15, maybe even top 10 next for Marco Tulio, real good middleweight prospect. Brandon Royval versus Joshua Van obviously was supposed to be Manel Cap. He's now pulled out, and we've got Joshua Van coming in, who is now on a 4-fight winning streak, and he's had 5 fights within the last year. Joshua Van's one of the best flyweight prospects right now. He's active, he's winning fights, he's fun to watch, and he's got a massive fan base because of it. He's an absolute beast in the flyweight division. And imagine if he beats Brandon Royval. Imagine Joshua Van manages to pull off the win against Brandon Royval. He'd probably be a favourite against the greatest flyweight in modern history in Pantoja. He would probably be a favourite because he's got a lead takedown defense. He's young, active, consistent. If he can get past a beast in Royval, I think Joshua Van might even be a favourite against Pantoja. So, huge fight for Joshua Van. Risky move, especially for the fact that he literally just fought on the last pay-per-view 2 weeks ago. But if he can get past if he can get past Brandon Royval, he's going to be fighting for a belt. Some other fight announcements. We've got Ming Shi back. If you don't know Ming Shi, she absolutely brutally knocked out her opponent at UFC Macau last year. I think probably the most brutal women MMA knockout of the year. She's a beast. She's taking on Bruna Brazil. Should be fun. We've got GM3 versus Macau. Low-level middleweights going at it, but they're both coming. Well, Macau's coming off a win. Also now the Fighting Nerds. We've got Nate Landwehr versus Morgan Charrier. Nate Landwehr, the featherweight, the shit version of Justin Gaethje, versus Morgan Charrier, who is a skilled, dangerous striker, never going to hit the top 15, but that should also be a fun stand-up fight. Interested to see how that goes. Brian Battle versus Ruzi Boyev. Two of some of the best unranked welterweights right now, both on a huge winning streak, both destroying everyone. That's a really good fight. Winner gets somebody in the top 15, leaning towards Ruzi Boyev, but that's another fight that's kind of pure violence. I'm looking forward to that. We've got Bobby Green versus Diego Ferreira, two veterans going at it. Listen, they're not giving Bobby Green any easy fights. To go from obviously Paddy Pimblett to Mauricio Hufe. So now Diego Ferreira, yes, it's a step down, but Diego Ferreira is a beast. It was only last year or whatever it was where he destroyed Mercedes Rembetsky. That should be fun. I'm going Rembetsky to win that one though. We've got Edson Barboza versus Drakkar Klose. Again, another banger to get Edson Barboza back in, but at this point, Edson Barboza probably should be retiring. Francis Marshall versus Austin Bashi. If you don't know Austin Bashi, last year or early this year, he was like a 13-0 prospect in the bantamweight division. People thought he was going to go quite far. Ended up losing to C-Rod, and Francis Marshall just arguably beat what's his name, Myron Santos, who just destroyed Sadiq Youssef. So this should be fun. I think Austin Bashi can do we can really see how good Austin Bashi is in the UFC based off this performance. We've also got Rembetsky versus Chris Duncan, absolute banger of a fight that they've just stuck in the apex for no reason. So again, bad matchmaking by the UFC, but that's just a bit of an argument. Is the UFC falling off? Is it not? Let me know your thoughts, and also some fight announcements that are coming out in the UFC, because the UFC seems to be booking fights left, right, and center. Let me know your thoughts. Do you agree with the UFC falling off argument? Thank you for watching.